Hello and good afternoon and welcome. My name is Chris Reed. I'm with University of Toronto Press. And on behalf of everybody at the press, I would like to welcome you to the launch of the new collection, No Better Home, edited by David Kaufman. And we have the distinct pleasure today of presenting today's launch in conjunction with our good friends at the Miles Nadal Jewish Community Center. And it's my pleasure now to hand the screen over to my friend and colleague Esther Arbeid, the Director of Arts and Culture at the Miles Nadal Jewish Community Center. Esther, over to you.
Well, thank you, Chris. It's such a joy for us to be partnering on our third, I believe, book launch with U of T Press. I just want to take a moment to say that as we gather virtually together in Toronto, I want to acknowledge that Toronto is in the ditch with one spoon territory, a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee. Toronto is still home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And we recognize the diversity of the First Peoples of this area and honor them as stewards of this land, builders of community, and the keepers of culture. And now, let's start the program. Please welcome our moderator and contributor to this book, Hesh Troper. Hesh is the professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, U of T, and is the author or co-author of 10 books. Over to you, Hesh. Hesh, you're on mute.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here, and I am honored to moderate a panel on this new book. And full disclosure, I am not only the moderator, but I am one of the contributors to this book as well. Our panel today includes the editor of the book, David Kaufman, who is the J. Richard Schiff Chair for Jewish Studies at York University, and I was also a professor in the Department of History at York University. Also on the panel is Yolanda Cohen, a professor in the Department of History at the University of Quebec in Montreal. And our third panelist is Jeffrey Weidlinger, who is Joseph Brodsky Collegiate Professor of History and Judaic Studies and Director of the Franklin Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Michigan. To get things off to a start, I'm going to ask David, who is the editor of this book, if he could tell us something about where the idea for this particular book comes from, and if he would also add something about why the book is focused on the notion of home. And if you look at the title, it's No Better Home with a question mark. David?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Let me first thank you, Hesh, for doing this interview, and also thank Esther and Chris and all the people at U of T Press and the JCC. Really, it's nice to have such an event. So yeah, the book came about as part of a brainstorm that some colleagues and I had at York in the history department about what we ought to do at the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of Canadian Confederation. And there was a kind of more of a cerebration than celebration tone, like let's think about what Canada means. And since I sit in a chair and focus largely my research on Canadian Jewish history, I thought, oh, maybe we should get some people together to think about Canada broadly, not the historical moment of Canada coming into being, but Canadian life from a broad perspective. And we had a symposium with a number of the contributors to the book, Not everyone who was a symposium contributor contributed to the book, and vice versa. But in the end, we managed to produce this volume that combines a lot of the leading scholars of Canadian Jewish studies from different academic disciplines, writing essays that meditate on the theme of home in some way, and about half the contributors who are writing about Canada for the first time as professional academics, but who have some connection to Canada. So these are scholars who either are Canadian and have left, or are non-Canadian who move and live in move to Canada or work here for a long time. So it's a kind of unique volume, a unique collection of essays that hopes to kind of broaden the field. As for the title, yeah, the title it's a little bit cheeky, you know. There's basically there's three elements. There's the question of better in the title, the name home, and of course the question mark. So the title is really meant just to be a point of departure, although I'm kind of happy for the provocative nature of it, that if there were no question mark, it would be a declaration. Canada is a better home. With a question mark, it doesn't cast doubt on it, it just invites a kind of set of questions about it. And so while only a couple of the essays in the book actually try to answer this question directly, Morton Weinfeld has an essay in it that compares social scientific data on integration of Jews in Canada and on the kind of quality of Jewish cultural retention, of Jewish religious observance, and the extent to which Jews in Canada remain Jewish, and compare these data on Canada with France and the UK, and a second essay by Hasia Diner that looks at all of the actions of migrants to North America and notes that they overwhelmingly chose to go to the United States and not Canada. So Mort has a kind of yes answer and Hasia has a kind of no answer. But most of the essays in the book offer a meditation on this idea of home, which of course is it's an open thing, it's an elusive thing, it's a powerful emotional concept. And as you know from the book, but people perhaps on the call don't know, it's a way to get at many different senses of what it means to belong as Jews to Canada. The last thing I want to say is that the better part also invites a certain number of comparisons. Better than what? Better than other countries, better than other countries now where there is Jewish life, or a vertical kind of question. Is this a better home now than Jews have had in the past? And I try to unpack the meaning of the question. Why ask a question like this, which is not a very scholarly question, but I still try to unpack it in scholarly terms in the introduction to the book.
Thank you. Quite by chance, all three panelists, and add myself to that, are historians in a book that is made up of people who come from any number of disciplines, social science, humanities. But as historians, could each of you take a few minutes and explain about your particular focus? Because we all come at this from very, very different points of view, using the art that we have as historians. And shed some light on what it means to contribute to a book on the Canadian home. Perhaps we could start with you, Yolanda. You'll have to unmute.
Yes.
There you go.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for organizing this wonderful event. And I would say that following David's comments, I was thinking more like no better home rather than no better place. And I agree with him with the question mark. Because for me, for most displaced persons, finding a home is no easy achievement, as we all know. As a displaced person myself, and as a historian of post-colonial migrations, which were people were by the million trying to find a home after leaving theirs, I can say that most of the time, we in fact try our best to belong wherever the fate or the maelstrom of events had brought us to. So it's really even more difficult for those populations, amongst which I am, which had been already estranged by colonial powers from their own home, while still inhabiting their then century-old homes or countries. It's very difficult to elaborate on what could be their home. So Albert Memmi very aptly called this feeling exil intérieur, or inner exile, which means that you are at home, but not really at home because yourself is already estranged from your traditions. So this is the case of most North African Jews who left their countries like I did to come first to Israel. So for them, there was no other home than Israel and Zionism. Most 80% of the Moroccan Jews went to Israel. And for the westernized fringes of these populations, they went either to France when they could get papers, or came the other bit of people came to Montreal and some to Toronto, mainly the Hispanics. So it was very interesting for me to see that in the essays collected in this book, there are really several forms, as you said, of belonging. One of them being the strong dedication of Jews that became Canadian to build their own institutions and more largely to participate fully rather than to contribute into whatever they could fit in the larger Canadian culture and society. So for me, what struck me in the book is the resolute perspective of almost all the contributors of inscribing Jewish history within the larger framework of Canadian history and in crucial aspects of its eventful narrative. So giving Jews full agency as subject of their history is for me one of the main contribution of this book. And I wouldn't deal too much into what I had been describing myself in my own piece, but I'll go on with the pieces written by other colleagues who struck me as very important contribution to that story. But I'll do it later, maybe. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jeffrey?
So I'll also say thank you to all of you for organizing it. Thank you, Hesh, for moderating this conversation. Thank you, David, for putting it all together and for putting together the conference that inspired this, however many years ago that was. And to point out that was an interesting idea for a conference, an interesting idea of bringing these people together, some of whom are actually experts on Canadian Jews and Canadian Jewish history, and others who just happen to be Canadians who study other aspects of Jewish civilization and life, like myself. I'm a Canadian and have been living in the United States since 1993, where I study Jewish history in Eastern Europe. So I was surprised to get this invitation, but really interested in exploring it. And, I didn't answer the question, no better home, is there a better home than Canada, in my essay. I allude to it, but I didn't answer it directly. But I will say something about that right now, which is, of course, as David points out in the great introduction to the book, it's really an unanswerable question. You have to ask how you're going to measure better than what, how you measure home is a whole bunch of things that one needs to get at in order to answer that question. But fundamentally, as a historian of the Jewish experience over the longue durée on a global, in a global context, I find it very difficult to imagine any place better than Canada to grow up, as I did, as somebody who identifies as Jewish, than, in Canada in the last 50 years or so. So I will say that outright in the sum, that I think there are few places in the world in which Jews have felt as secure as they do in Canada right now and have in the last 50 years. And that's just an interesting point to put in that I think some of the others make in the articles as well. The particular element of that I chose to investigate is the idea of multiculturalism, because multiculturalism has always fascinated me. And going through to the 1988 Multiculturalism Act that actually declared multiculturalism as a fundamental characteristic of the Canadian heritage. I had always thought, or in my own studies of Jewish history in Eastern Europe, I'd always heard echoes of multiculturalism in the people that I study. People like the historian and activist Shimon Dubnov, who wrote about Jewish autonomy in the diaspora, and wrote about the idea that Jews can form really what one could say a distinct society in the diaspora, that Jews living in the diaspora should be given autonomy in education, autonomy in language use. They should be able to have proportional representation in parliament. There are a whole list of criteria that Dubnov and others writing in Ukraine in the early 20th century believed should be ascribed to national minorities, what were called national minorities at the time. And it always struck me that this resembled the way Canadians talk about multiculturalism, the way Charles Taylor talks about a space for recognition, or the philosopher at Queen's University, Will Kimlicka, talks about group differentiated rights, or a special status for minority cultures. And so in the essay I wrote, I decided to actually investigate those roots and investigate whether there is a connection between what the Jews were saying in Ukraine in the 1910s and 1920s and what Canadians were saying in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it turns out that there was a very direct connection. That in fact, when the Royal Commission on bilingualism and biculturalism was established by Lester Trudeau in 1963, it was precisely Ukrainians and people who actually knew Ukrainian history, people like Yaroslav Rudnitsky, who was a professor of Ukrainian history at the University of Manitoba, and later Paul Yuzik, who was a professor of Ukrainian history at Ottawa University and became a United States Senator, and was the first to speak about multiculturalism in the public, was first to speak about multiculturalism in Parliament. And it was them who introduced the idea of multiculturalism into the Canadian discourse, because they objected to this notion of biculturalism, that there are two cultures in Canada, French and English culture. And it was the Ukrainians who said, actually, there's a whole third element of those who are neither English nor French. And we need to be included in this conversation. Canada is not bicultural, it's multicultural. And this is exactly what Jews were saying in Ukraine 50 years earlier. They were saying that Ukraine isn't just bicultural, it's not just Ukrainian and Russian, but there's also Jews and Poles and Germans and all of these other groups that need to be recognized. So these historians of Ukraine were adopting the language that had been introduced by Jews to talk about this third element, or this third group of people who are neither of the two major cultures and should be included in this notion of multiculturalism. So I was really interested in that link, and I think in the little essay I wrote, I show that there is a direct link. And I'll just add one other thing that I find interesting, is that when these discussions were taking place in the 60s, 70s, and 80s about the nature of multiculturalism, the Jewish community, by and large, was objecting to the notion of multiculturalism. And the reason for that is, prior to the notion of multiculturalism, people thought of Canada as a Judeo-Christian place, that there were really two or three religions, Catholicism, Protestantism, and Judaism. And so the Jews were raised to that level as one of the big three. Once you bring multiculturalism into the context, then Jews sink in importance and become one of just hundreds of other nationalities, and they lose that important position at the very top with Protestantism and Catholicism. So it's interesting how Jews who actually originated this whole concept of multiculturalism in Ukraine, when it's brought over to Canada in a slightly different form, they're objecting to it because they want to preserve their status as a religious group rather than as a cultural group. So I thought it was really interesting, and it's that multiculturalism that we've all benefited from, that I so appreciated growing up. And it was interesting to trace how my own academic work can be traced to those ideas that I grew up with.
Yeah. David?
Can I put it back to you, actually, Hesh, to talk about your contribution? I'm going to be brief about mine.
Sure. I've, as a historian, always be tried to find that line between where Jews who were in Canada became part of Canada. And in this particular essay, I use politics and indeed municipal politics here in Toronto, looking at the election of the first Jewish mayor and what did that represent? How did that happen in a city when he was elected that was still very much, as I put it in the essay, an outpost of British civility, almost a late Victorian city on the edges of Lake Ontario. How is it that a Jewish mayor could be elected in that world that was really controlled in so many ways at the municipal level by the Orange Lodge? And I look at that particular election as was it a turning point? Was it more accident than a shift? And look particularly at the man who was elected, Phillips, to understand that he was not what we would call a Volksmensch. If you were going to elect a Jew to be mayor of Toronto, you couldn't find somebody who was more Toronto than Nathan Phillips. But still, it did represent a huge event. As I said to Mort Weinfeld a couple of days ago, when will we see a Jewish mayor elected in Montreal? It does speak to a very, very interesting issue of how urban life in Canada has evolved differently for Jews based on the urban context. Anyway, David?
Yeah, so my own contribution to the book is an essay that plays with the idea of settling and unsettling Canadian Jewish history, and it tracks the kind of long arc of Jewish encounters with Indigenous people in Canadian history. And the aim of this essay is to do two things. One, it's kind of a challenge essay. It's an essay that asks us to kind of rethink the grand narrative of an immigrant community, of an immigration narrative, to recast it as not only an immigrant narrative, which it is, but also a narrative about colonialism, the forces that brought Jews and many other minorities to Canada, as of course the United States, as being part of a process of dislocation, of removing homes, of disrupting homes for the people who lived here. So it asks us to take this process seriously, and it does so by tracing points of connection, actual face-to-face connection that involved business and settlement and sometimes violence, and other kinds of more abstract or kind of imagined versions of connection in the realm of culture, but tries to do a very broad angle or a broad lens tracing of intersections between Jews and Indigenous people, and in this way, complicates the idea of home for us.
Yeah, that was very interesting. Can
I add something?
Sure, Yolanda.
Yes, I just wanted to tell you that in Montreal we had a Jewish mayor, Michael, for a few months, and his fate was very bad. And we had a chief of the opposition now who has yarmulke wearing, but he's not a mayor, obviously, and I don't think he's going to present himself. I just want to make a few comments, if I can,
sure, please.
On your essays. All of three of your essays, for me, are dealing with the changes that Jewish experience and expertise have been bringing about in municipal politics, as you said, with Nathan Phillips, and also of Jeff's evocative story of multiculturalism as brought to us by a small group of Ukrainian intellectuals and activists. But I would go on with David's provocative essay, because for me it shows how the first Jewish merchants participation to settler colonialism tainted their encounters with the indigenous First Nation, and as such was part of the Anglo-Protestant elite domination. I would add to what David had been showing in his essay, that these very merchants' families, the Hart, the Joseph, the De Sola, etc., also had the reflex, so to speak, to build their own synagogues and Jewish institutions on the post-memory of the Inquisition and their exile and estrangement from Spain and Portugal, and gave the name to their first building, to the synagogue they built, the first one in the continent, as well as Shearit Israel, or the remnant of Israel. So my remark here would be that we could see at play both the dominant and the dominated, the colonized and the colonizing, and those aspects are going really hand in hand rather than are contradictory. And as we can see elsewhere in the world, or even in Quebec, where Quebec, for instance, society doesn't see, or the Francophone don't see themselves as only dominant today vis-a-vis the indigenous people, because they think of themselves as dominated by the English. So it seems to me that those strains are really important to weave together, and David's essay brings us there. Thank you.
Thanks, Yolande.
Oh, that's interesting. As we're all authors of this, one of the things that I mentioned when we were talking before the session was whether there are any other articles, special articles. Actually, David, you mentioned the kind of debate between Mort Weinfeld and Hasia Diner in the essay. Are there any essays that you, as a participant, would recommend that others read? I should say that I was particularly taken with Hasia Diner's argument that Canada, which we all, in a sense, are celebrating in this book, was, according to her, not a land of second chance for Jews who arrived here, but a land of second choice. They would much rather have gone to the land of the South, where Jeffrey finds himself now. Is there anything? Is there something that you would want others to really read besides your own work? I should say Hasia was my first choice, but.
Let me go first on this one. There are so many essays that are, I think they're all great. It's really, I'm quite proud of how it all came together. And I've done and will do a couple more of these book events. And, I think I'll probably end up speaking about each one a little bit about different places. I've certainly spoke about yours, Yolande, and about yours, Jeff, which I think are just amazing essays. And your contribution, Hash, has inspired me to contemplate and start research on a larger project about Jewish mayors in Canada, because it's a fascinating story that you tell, but it's also fascinating, or it's additionally, it's fascinating that there have been something like 50 mayors, 50 Jewish mayors across all the provinces, even one or two of the territories, from the 19th century through the 21st, in small towns, in big cities, in French and in English Canada, conservative mayors and, far left-leaning communist Jewish mayors, and the study of the Jewish mayor, who doesn't seem to have his, for the most part, Jewishness limit his capacity to exercise power at the municipal level, although the idea of a Jewish premier or a Jewish prime minister or a Jewish foreign minister is much harder to fathom, or even the head of a party. And yet, exercising power at the municipal level seems to, is not really a challenge for electorates, or maybe it is. Anyway, this is, I think, a topic worthy of a bigger exploration. So maybe one day it'll be another book that I write, and it's thanks to you for producing, such a great starting point. I did want to highlight two other ones quickly. One essay is Mia Spiro's essay about Holocaust survivors and how they perceived Canada and wrote about Canada in their memoirs, which, you know, are a kind of minor note in the story that they have to tell when they tell about, when they speak about their own emigration and their arrival in Canada, because they have a Holocaust story to tell. But in aggregate, what she did was put together dozens and dozens of descriptions and mentions of what, you know, what the experiences of coming to Canada is like, and thinking about Canada becoming a home for Holocaust survivors who have, you know, freighted with such trauma about home is really fascinating study. And the last one, I think, actually a really important essay is the last of the substantive essays by Pierre Anctil, who is a wonderful scholar of Jewish life in Quebec and in Montreal in particular. And his essay is about language, and it's a little bit of a polemic for the field as a field of scholarship, and the kind of problem that that arises from the, you know, the sort of the fact that the French language scholarship on Canadian Jewish life and English language scholarship are not in fruitful enough dialogue with one another, and that much of the work that's produced in English-speaking Canada, often by historians and social scientists and literature specialists who are Jews themselves, doesn't deal with sources in French. So it's a really interesting and very powerful polemic about the field of Canadian Jewish studies and the, you know, the biculturalism, bilingual problem that undergirds it.
Jeff?
Maybe I'll chime in. Just first a comment actually on something that that's been mentioned a few times, which is the Jews as mayors and Jews as, you know, heads of state and all that. I'm just always very cautious about using that as any type of metric for how well Jews are doing in any given society. Given, you know, that Germany had a Jewish foreign minister in the 1920s, and France, of course, had a Jewish prime minister in the 1930s, and it didn't really do those states all that well about 10 years later. Ukraine has had in recent history a Jewish prime minister and a Jewish president. So these things don't always, you know, translate the way we would like them to. And the United States also has had some Jews in high levels of government that haven't necessarily done good things for the Jewish communities of those countries in general. Just kind of put out that cautionary note out there. But as far as the other essays, I actually, ones that hasn't been mentioned, I mean, in addition to all those that have been mentioned, one that hasn't been mentioned is, I think, Lois Dubin's, which I also really liked, on the city of Trieste and how she became interested in the city of Trieste and its relationship to the Montreal that she grew up in. And I guess in some ways, I like it because it's similar to my essay that talks about the multiculturalism of the late Habsburg Empire and how she recognized her own identity within the multiculturalism of Montreal in Trieste. So I thought that was also an interesting, a really interesting paper to read. The book fits very well together, I thought, in general.
Yolanda, your
sorry, I agree to what I liked a lot about the book is the extent to which we are discovering stories about being Jewish in Hamilton, or revisiting the question of Montreal Jews and the division between Montreal and Toronto, and how Ira Robinson takes us back again on this question of the Quebec Quiet Revolution and the Quebec language divide, and how Jews left Montreal, and Toronto became this the main cities for Jewish life. So I kind of really looked at all those essays. They bring, each one of them brings some kind of particular way of being Jewish in Canada. And I would say that maybe one of the things that I found missing, maybe, if I may, although it's already too much, maybe in for one book, it's probably the moment of one of the main contribution, to my view, of the Jewish community to Canadian history is probably human rights. And it is touched by many essays in the book, but it's not taken as a whole, and probably because we got a little bit away from all the Holocaust stories, and so we didn't touch at that. But I think this is a very important aspect of Jewish, not contribution, but participation into the Canadian history.
Can I just jump in? In the Q&A, I noticed that James Walker, a great scholar in his own right, who I assign in my Canadian Jewish History course, has asked a question about whether a panelist might comment on the efforts undertaken by Canadian Jews to gain equal rights, and about the legacy of these rights fights in general. So since you mentioned it, I wonder if you might want to say something more about this. Indeed, it's one of many things that are actually missing from the book. But here's another follow-up question for you.
Is this to me that?
Yeah,
sorry. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I thought you wanted James to interview.
Oh, well, James asked the question. I mean, no. The irony is that James can answer it probably better than any of us. I'm not sure we're allowed to unmute.
I just wanted to outline this aspect because when the Moroccan Jews arrived in Montreal, the biggest effort of Canadian Jewry was really around opening up the gates of Canadian immigration. And the Jewish organization had been really very influential or decisive into that process, but because they had been lobbying into that, not only in Canada, but at the international level, with obviously the help of the American Jews that were really pushing the United Nations and to establish UNRWA, the organization for refugees. And obviously it was a very important question, but Canadian Jewry took that at heart and lobbied the government in a very, very important matter. But you all know that. So and it became something very important, even as Canada became more humanitarian, and the welfare state that was established after Second World War became a humanitarian aspect with the opening of the gates of the frontier. So this is just what I wanted to say.
Yes, I think you're quite right. I think that with the Holocaust survivors after the Second World War, and then the Sephardic North African immigration, the whole notion of refugees became rewritten in the Canadian mind, and Canadian immigration policy, with regard to refugees, is heavily imprinted with those earlier Jewish intakes. I just want to add one more thing. One very, very quick round before I open up and invite people to submit questions in the Q&A is I recall the dictator in Mexico, Diaz, some turn of the last century, once had occasion to say, "Pity poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." Is the same thing also true for the Canadian Jewish community? Does that also come out in our essays in a way that we are shaped by the North American pan that we're baked in? That we are? Is there a Canadian Jewry, or is there a North American Jewry with Canadian Jewry as a branch plant? I'm inclined to think that we are very different and very separate, but that's very hard sometimes to talk in terms of Canadian Jewry without reference to you talked about, Yolanda, the movement of Montreal Jews to Toronto, making Toronto the headquarters of Canadian Jews, but the headquarters of Canadian Jews, some would argue, is New York. It's a very, very intriguing thing to share this continent, even Jews to share this continent with the United States. And that notion, I hate to go on, that we're here almost by accident. We're here because we couldn't get into the United States, is a very, very interesting idea to roll out. And we may, in the end, be grateful for that accident. But
I'll comment on this one. I mean, Hesh, I think you're absolutely right that there's no way of possibly understanding or conceiving of Canadian Jewry, if there even is a national Jewry to be thought of at all, without comparisons and interactions and all the influences of American Jewry. And it's certainly been, the dominant preoccupation for Canadian Jewish social scientists and historians to think about Canada in light of the American experience. Even the recent kind of national community census, the 2018 survey of Jews in Canada, was modeled very closely on the Pew Portrait of Jewish American survey that tried to get a big snapshot of what Canadian Jews are thinking, how they feel about politics and about religion and about identity and many other issues. This is all with reference to the American data as a kind of baseline. The same thing is true certainly when we think about, the kind of issues of settler colonialism and this continent not as two political entities, Canada and the United States, but as a kind of continental mass migration movement. However, that said, I think it's very beneficial for scholars of Canadian Jewish life and for Canadian Jews in general to think about how life in Canada compares with, is similar and different from Jewries with other maybe similar size nations like France or Argentina, or similarly politically situated, historically situated countries like, say, Australia or South Africa, or other parts of the British Commonwealth, and that we might see many different sorts of new insights when we compare Canada with some place other than the United States. So we did a panel with a bunch of Canadian Jewish historians, with Latin American Jewish historians just the other week at a conference, and it was totally fascinating, new as far as I could tell, and hopefully there'll be publications that grow out of this. And we've likewise planning a similar kind of panel, putting scholars of Canadian Jewish life in dialogue with scholars of Australian Jewish life in the spring, and see what we come up with when we compare, a different sort of apple with another different sort of apple. So I would just say that it's actually really fruitful and helpful to think about other, as many different sorts of comparisons as we can.
Just if I can give an answer first to Hesh's question, then an answer to the comment on something that's going on in the Q&A or the comment section. First, I've always thought it'd be really interesting, and I tried to do this at one point, to take two ships that left the port of Hamburg the same day. And I actually found two ships that did this in 1908, and one went to Halifax and one went to New York. And you can use genealogical databases to actually search what happened to those people and how did it differ? What happened 10 years after for the ones who landed in Halifax versus New York? What happened 30 years after, 50 years after, 60, 70 years after? Where are their children now? Where are their grandchildren? And to actually take that and, take some random ships that left the same day, the same port, and compare, generations later, what the differences were and what happened to those families. I'd still love to do that. It's a hard project to do.
If you ever do, please consider publishing it in Canadian Jewish Studies, the journal that I would love to publish more of your work.
Yeah, I always thought it'd be an interesting thing to do. I'm doing work now on genealogical stuff, looking at this Galveston project, which is a project to divert Jewish immigration away from New York through the Great Plains of America and the Middle West. So I'm interested in that sort of stuff. The other thing I just wanted to comment on, because it struck me, there's a lot of comments in the comments and chat here on the diversity of the Jewish experience. and the diversity of the Jewish experience as reflected in the book, which I think does a better job than the conference a few years ago did. But I think that's also because of our growing awareness in the last few years of the diversity of Jewish experiences. But I noticed that there's several references to Leonard Cohen in it as, you know, kind of the quintessential Canadian Jewish artist. And I couldn't find a single reference to Drake, who is probably the most famous Canadian Jewish artist. In fact, you know, I looked it up recently as the most streamed artist ever on Spotify, and yet isn't really acknowledged in this book or in a lot of other, you know, writings on Canadian Jewish identity. So that just kind of struck me as something to put out there and to, you know, think about why.
One of the questions that was put into the Q&A speaks to presumably the internal pluralism within the Jewish community. It's not just Jews and Ukrainians, Jews, and as a ethno-religious community, as opposed to Protestants and Catholics and so on. And where do we stand? But the nature of a Jewish community that has within it, here in Toronto, there is an Indian Jewish congregation that, or at least a minyan that meets every now and then, or the issue of Black Jews who converts and those who are born within the community, and the whole issue of the internal, the major internal divides. When we speak of, I presume, when we speak of community, are we really talking about a census category rather than a functional reality? And if we look at the political divisions within the community today, it becomes very difficult to talk about mamash. Who are the Jews? And I suggest that the diversity, and mentioned the growth, the beginnings of a Sephardi Jewish community here in Toronto, which was not Francophone Sephardi, but Spanish-speaking Sephardi. That I think is something that really deserves an awful lot more exploration. We touch on it in the book, but it's really intriguing to look at a city, let's say like Toronto, which is now edging up on 200,000 Jews, and saying, what are the communities within that community? And how do they interrelate and interfunction, and how do they see Toronto as or Canada as home? Very interesting stuff. David, your book opened a whole series of questions. Yolandi?
Yeah, just not to complete your diversity, the class division are still very important, and even though community activism tries to shed some to cover up this question of class by having philanthropic activities, still the class division are quite strong, even though, and that's probably why we're talking about the Jewish community still, is even though the upward mobility, social upward mobility, even for newcomers like the Moroccan Jews, was quite striking and very quick when you compare the arrival of Moroccan Jews in Montreal and their economic integration with the Portuguese or Haitians or any other number of communities in ethnic groups in Montreal. Moroccan Jews are faring much better. So it's quite something that, in fact, the institution or the completeness of the community institution is probably what is striking into the Jewish history in Canada. The extent to which the community institutions have been establishing schools and hospitals and philanthropic activities and social welfare, etc., had been a very important way of trying to bridge the gap between the classes.
Great point, Yolande. I just want to add to this diversity question as well, and speak specifically to the question of the book and its shortcomings. So Jeff, you're very right to point out what's missing, and some other questions in the chat and Q&A have also kind of asked questions about, the extent to which this is, sort of properly represents the diversity of Canadian Jewish life. And the answer is no, it doesn't. Although I will say that it's not for lack of trying. There are very few number of professional scholars in any field who deal, with anything that has to do with Canadian Jewish life. It's actually quite a small field, and I tried my darndest to see if we can solicit more, a greater range of, ethnic and racial in particular, sort of essays from people who had some expertise and could write about these things in a sophisticated, in a way that would fit for a crossover academic, accessible book. And I just couldn't. The first batch of essays that came out of the symposium were a kind of, it was random, it was gunshot, like whatever came. And afterwards, when it was time to think about putting together a book, I had these questions very much at the forefront of my mind. So that's on the, we're still in the nascent moment, and these questions that are being asked and that have been brought to the table now are very important ones, and they're ones that scholars have to take seriously as we move the field forward. On the upside, there are more young researchers who are interested in these questions, who are doing undergraduate theses and master's theses that I know of, including in the classes that I teach at York University. There are more archivists that are interested in highlighting and spotlighting collections within their archival repositories that can offer, information to journalists and documentarians and scholars and all sorts of people who are interested in surfacing these dynamics and histories. And there are plans in the works, let's say, plans in the works to try to bring this more to the forefront of the scholarly conversation, public scholarly conversation about Canadian Jewish life.
Yeah, we just had somebody made a comment about the fact that I'll just quote, there are senior internationally renowned Canadian artists and also art historians could make a separate book. What has happened here is that this book unlocks a wealth of other questions that have to be addressed. It's quite extraordinary how the Canadian Jewish field, for a relatively small community of Canadian Jews, unlocks a series of questions about Jewish life, about the intricacies of change in the world today. It's incredible how a book with such a diversity of topics begs you to move on to a series of other topics. And indeed, my graduate students, yours, I'm sure, Jeff, and your graduate students are opening doors on all kinds of aspects of this question that we would not have thought possible to address just a few years ago because of the lack of interest. And now there is enormous rising interest in this stuff. We are very close to the end of our time.
I just wanted to quickly put a link in the chat there, which is a link to the journal called Canadian Jewish Studies, Études Juives Canadiennes, a bilingual kind of multidisciplinary journal that tries to publish the new interesting research on Canadian Jewish life. So if there are people who are on the call who are interested in reading up on more, this is one good place to start.
Absolutely. And perhaps we could come to the end by circling back over the question again of that is addressed in the title. David, you want to lead us in? This is, after all, no better home with a question mark.
Right. So maybe I'll also read Baruch Friedman Cole's question in the Q&A. He says, fascinating to have this book launch while Jewish organizations are calling for governmental and civic leaders to speak up against anti-Semitism in Canada. Given what our historical studies show about Jewish integration into Canada, are contemporary responsive reflective of exaggerated international fear and anxiety, or are these responses indicative of a real social breakdown? Well, I'm not sure that Baruch, I would answer this as an either or thing. Wait, Hesh, is this what you had in mind? Like kind of no better home in light of this particular moment?
Yes, and as historians, it's easy for us to say, let's stand back and wait 10 years and go in and evaluate what is actually taking place at this particular moment. But I think that there are as the rabbi's comments reveal, there is a very real sense of anxiety and questioning and re-examining Canada within the context even of that title that you lay out. We are I suspect at a very interesting juncture in the Canadian Jewish community today. I'm not exactly sure how to address those anxieties, but certainly we have to acknowledge that at this particular moment they're there. And one of the things that is not addressed, it's addressed in every one of the essays in an odd way, but the direct relationship of Canadian Jews to Israel is not a topic that comes on, but is certainly at this juncture worthy of a book, of a conference, of a real, very, very careful and close examination, and where how we collectively respond to our linkages of identity rather than national linkages are become very, very intriguing at this time.
I must say that the events of 2 weeks ago and last week in Côte-Saint-Luc and Hampstead in Montreal of Jewish harassment, and part of my family lives in Côte-Saint-Luc, and they told me that they were ready to leave, and I was startled because
for where
this part were living. That was my question immediately. Where are you going to go? And Israel. And we didn't see as much as in France this movement of North African Jews, mainly North African, but not exclusively, because there is a religious part also of immigration. But for the last 10 years in France, because of the renewed anti-Semitism and the very harsh anti-Semitism that is spreading in France, most of my family had left to Israel. That is 30 or 40 years after they left Morocco. So here, we never had to speak about that. It was just like obvious that we were finally at home in Montreal. And all of a sudden, this, and it, of course, we know as a historian, it's not all of a sudden, we know that anti-Semitism has been always there, but it seems to me that it becomes somehow normal to be anti-Semite. That's, it's not, you don't have this shameness, or you don't have a blockage to express anti-Semitic sentiments. And that's what we were witnessing 2 weeks ago. So, of course, it came, for me, it came as a real shock. And at the same time, a realization that, yes, maybe I was in this book saying that for me, it was the best home for me to be in Montreal. And all of a sudden, I found myself wondering, where is my home? And I thought, well, there's no place to hide for Jews. And that's really my feeling today.
Thank you. You know, I have the unpleasant, very unpleasant task of cutting everybody off, because we have it's less than 1 minute before the this webinar is going to go out from under us. So at this point, and at this moment when we could get into a discussion that could go on till all hours. I'm the one who has to just thank all of you, thank the U of T, thank the JCC, thank David for editing the book, thank our panelists for being part of this, and invite you, all of those people who are still with us, to have a look at the book, and if you have any questions, address them to David. Thank you very much. Thank all of you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thanks,
for
everyone.
coming.
That was really great. Don't forget to buy the book. The link is in there. Thank you, everyone who attended and made time in their afternoon for such a stimulating and thoughtful discussion. To Harold and Yolande and Jeffrey and Chris and the team at UTP and David. Thanks all, and have a good Shabbat. Good night.